Right. Hello, everybody. I must say, it's a bit mind-blowing to think that people in all the, how many corners does the world have? Four corners? I don't know, but I do find that a bit stimulating and scary at the same time. But anyway, I'm going to talk about a little bit about training. And there's a document that I can talk about, but I want to devote most of the talk to talking about the kind of spirit of training. What do we mean by Buddhist training in quite a wide, generic sense, really? And like a lot of people, I tuned in on Tuesday night to the chanting at different times, and that in itself was an interesting experience because I'm used to doing chanting like in the old days at Narborough or at Malvern when we're all together and we kind of can hear what's going on and we don't have to mute each other. And it's an interesting experience because of Zoom and all the different problems with sound synchronization. And there was a lot of feedback, and it was a bit like being at a heavy metal concert for the first few minutes because it was all kind of coming in. And then Jananamati came on, and I could just hear his Namo Amida Bu, and I thought, I'm going to tune into that, and I'll stick with Janamati because he knows what he's doing and he knows the patterns of this thing. And as I kind of tuned into him, everything else sort of made sense, that the Nembutsu became the center of everything, and everybody else and all the extraneous noise kind of all kind of fed in, and it all made sense that although it was fairly discordant, there was a kind of common core of practice there. And it's a good metaphor, I think, for the centrality of the Nembutsu in our practice and how everything is kind of rooted in that, and that's the key to training. And I think everything is centered on Nembutsu and faith for us, and any training should take us towards this and heighten our appreciation of it. And we keep coming back to it. And so any training regime needs to center itself on that and not drift off into irrelevant practices. And it should help us view everything that we do as Nembutsu. Precept 20 is to view all practices as forms of Nembutsu. And training should support the ability of Nembutsu to transform us. So we need to study and learn summary of faith and practice, for example, a document that I've spent a lot of time looking at over the last few years. And of course, we have to remember that whatever we do in the way of training doesn't guarantee that we're going to be on an ordination path or accepted for ordination. And Dhamma has constantly reminded us that faith and the needs of the Sangha are the main determining factors in ordination, and that discipleship is more caught than taught. I think it's fair to view it as a transmission. I know transmission's got all sorts of traditional resonances, but it still holds true today. So the first part of my talk is going to be on the revised training guide, which was produced by Dhamma and a lot of acharyas in August of this year. And the training has been kind of rethought, for want of a better word, for a changing world and a global Sangha, which is, of course, the theme of this retreat. I mean, there are huge issues that we all face. Some of them are peculiar to Britain, but there's political upheavals, new configurations. For example, we're struggling with the Brexit stuff at the moment, environmental issues, gross inequalities and exploitation, both between and within nations, refugee problems, incipient religious conflicts. The list goes on. And they're all linked. Many of them disproportionately affect women and children across the world. And they're all exacerbated, of course, by COVID. And these things are experienced by people at macro and micro level. And I think the micro is important. There's the big political stuff going on, changes of US presidents and all the rest of it. But these things filter through to our own lives to a greater or lesser extent. The micro is perhaps made worse because we can't have face-to-face contact with that many people at the moment. And I'm not suggesting that as AMIDA members, we could or should be involved in tackling all those problems. It would become fairly exhausted fairly quickly. But what I am saying is that this is, in my view, this is the current state of samsara, the world into which aspirants for ordination, trainees, whatever you want to call them, are entering. A world which can seem dispiritingly far from the pure land that we all seek. Now, my vantage point is that of a learning mentor on Vow 22, which is one of the AMIDA training courses, along with Introduction to Pure Land Buddhism and Buddhist Psychology. So I don't claim to be an expert on all aspects of training, and I recognize that effective training involves much more than an online training course, however good that is. And I do think it's pretty good, if I can put a word in for Vow 22. And importantly, training is only part of what is taken into account when selection for ordination is made. I've stressed that already, I think. Faith, spiritual progress, and the needs of the Sangha as a whole are the main driving forces behind the kind of route to ordination. So I'm going to talk about that for a little bit. And then the second part is about the spirit, what I've called the Bodhisattva spirit, which underlies any training that we do, which is its kind of underpinning philosophy. And I think, you know, the right intention of training has got to be to help others towards enlightenment, which is, of course, a Bodhisattva path. And to do that, one has to place oneself in the service of something other than and greater than oneself, and then act. And in acting, one is teaching or training other people and passing on what you know, what you've been trained to do, enabling others to walk the path too. And I refer you again, I'm referring to some of the vows as we go through. Vow 68, to learn to be at ease in receiving instruction, very important. Need to be fairly humble in order to be taught, I think, really, to put oneself on one side. And equally at ease in directing others, that one's actions in either capacity may be imbued with loving kindness. And there's another couple of, precepts rather than vows. Precept 85, to listen to others. And of course, many of those others will be suffering in one way and another. And seek to understand and appreciate the spirit of their lives. And precept 87, to acquire the eloquence of the Dharma. So again, you've got those two elements, to listen and learn, and then to pass on using your eloquence or lack of it. So that's a bit of background to it. So the first part, if I just talk about the training guide fairly briefly. Now, there's all sorts of goodies on display here. I think that the guide emphasizes that any training has got to be flexible. We're all different, and we need a training which is going to meet our individual needs. But I mean, the only thing I would add to that is that, slightly qualify that, is that I think it's important that trainees don't just remain in their comfort zone. We do try and extend ourselves a little bit. You know, we don't just pick bits from the menu which feed stuff that we already do. And keep asking the question, what form of ministry am I drawn towards? Follow and nurture your own sense of vocation through the training program, very important. We all have a sense of how we can. It sounds terribly grand, doesn't it, really? But it can be quite small scale as well. But, you know, we all have our own ways in which we think we can be of service to others. Some are larger than others. And the guide as I've hinted already, the guide very conveniently matches up some of the training opportunities with some of the precepts which ordained members of the Sangha take. So people can relate what they're learning to their own religious vows very directly. So what's actually in the training guide then? Well, the different sections, there's a section on other power training and development, a section on discipleship, and I love this Guru Yoga prayer which appears in the section on discipleship. May the teacher's body, speech and mind pour forth a nectar wise, pure and kind that streams out widely into the world, empowering me to do the great work. I love that. It's just fantastic. I think it's inspirational stuff, and I'll come back to talking more about the spirit later on. Taking refuge in the Sangha. We talked a lot about the Sangha throughout this week. I mean, Yaya was talking about the importance of strength of community and sense of engagement, and that's built into the training, of course. There's advice on how to study, which I think is important. I think ordination and training for ordination is not just for intellectuals. There's quite a lot of intellectuals or aspiring intellectuals in the Amida Sangha, and I think that it's important that we do kind of, without being patronizing in any sense, just broaden the range of that. And for example, on Vow 22, there's a huge range of kind of assessment opportunities available to people. It doesn't just have to be a kind of essay type stuff. And in fact, I've got an example here. I don't know if Beth is here at all, but this lady called Beth, I don't think she's able to come, but who produced, in response to a question on the trachea on Vow 22. And the trachea is quite tricky. I think Dhammavidya is probably the only one among us who fully understands it, but the trachea is a complex Buddhist piece of theology, for want of a better word, and how the three parts of it work together. And I don't know if you can see this, but this lady Beth, who lives in near Malvern in the UK, created this multimedia. Instead of writing an essay and she's actually very good at writing essays, but instead, on this particular occasion, instead of writing an essay, she produced this multimedia, beautiful piece of artwork with embroidery and painting and photography in it, which kind of blew me away, really. And it was such a personally felt response, and it's absolutely accurate in what it says. It doesn't kind of play fast and loose with the truth, but it's just such a creative response to a complex question, and she felt really comfortable with doing that rather than on that occasion creating a piece of written work. And people write poems and do little drama scripts and produce Dharma talks and all kinds of things. So that's how the flexibility it feeds into the how to study bit. So on Vow 22, there's a whole range of modules, and some are to do with Buddhist history, some to do with the working of ministry, some to do with organizing retreats, and so on and so forth. It's a very rich menu. There's a section on, to come back to the sections on the training guide, there's a section on priestly abilities, liturgy, rhetoric, in other words, how to express the Dharma, pastoral skills, Buddhist psychology, very important, of course, for Amida particularly, educational skills. There's a section on areas of study, Buddhist history and narratives, Dharma principles, the Vinaya, Buddhist ethics. So there's a lot to get your teeth into. There's a section in the guide on socially and culturally engaged Buddhism. In other words, our old friends resisting oppression, assisting the afflicted, demonstrating an alternative. And the final section is on faith and spiritual maturity. So those are the kind of nuts and bolts of training, if you like, that Dhammavidya and the Acharyas put together. And I wanted to go on now in the second half of my ramble through this to look at the kind of underpinning philosophy, because I think it's very inspiring. I think this is where people get their motivation from, really. So as you'll have noticed, I hope you'll have noticed that this training for aspirants for ordination is not training in a mechanical way. It's not a kind of Pavlovian thing and training as you train a dog, and nor is it a training in self-power to improve one's own religious accomplishments by honing our muscles in a kind of spiritual gymnasium. I think there's huge dangers in kind of spiritual pride in that kind of training. It's the underlying Nembutsu focused spirit, which I think is the really important thing. Now, of course, there are certain kinds of practical tasks to be undertaken and skills to be learned, like how to be a bell master. I never quite mastered how to be a bell master, although I have tried over the years. And in our Birmingham in the UK Sangha, which I'm a member, I diligently do try to, I did before lockdown anyway, try to master the bellmaster skills. But it's it's a lifetime's work for me. It's been put to the test tomorrow because a friend of mine is being ordained tomorrow morning, and he's asked me to be alongside him doing the bells, which should be very interesting on Zoom, but we'll have a go. So there are practical tasks that you have to learn to do. And if you're on an ordination route, I'm not, but if you are on the ordination route, there's things to do with, making your robes and your wagesa and stuff like this. And setting up a home temple, for example, there are rights and wrongs in the way of doing that. So there are practical tasks, but even so, I just want to come back and have a look at the kind of spirit which, in my view, underpins all of this. And I'm looking at this as kind of both an insider and an outsider, because I'm a mitra myself, so I'm kind of inside, but because I'm not ordained myself, it gives me a bit of an outsider perspective as well. And this is my personal take, and Dhamma may well shoot me down on some of this. And I do emphasize that it's my personal take on the Amida philosophy on this. And I want to start off with a bit of a digression, if you'll bear with me, and look briefly at something which at first sight has got little or nothing to do with Buddhism. And I want to look at a central idea of the 20th century Lithuanian Jewish philosopher, Emanuel Levinas, or Levinas. I never know quite how to pronounce him. I'm going to say Levinas, actually. So bear with me. In 1940, Levinas's family were murdered by the Nazis, and he himself was imprisoned in a labor camp. And as one might expect, this had a very profound and revolutionary effect on his philosophical thinking. I think it's fair to say that before then, he'd been a fairly traditional philosopher dealing with matters of language and logic and all this kind of stuff. But we talked a lot about, or heard a lot about, trauma this afternoon. I mean, here was a guy who was genuinely traumatized. Not that I'm diminishing anybody's sense of trauma, but here was a guy who had certainly good justification for calling himself traumatized. And it affected his thinking. And he took the traditional notion that philosophy is about the love of wisdom and inverted it and said, no, philosophy is about the wisdom of love. If we're going to survive as human beings, it's the love that is the central thing. And so once he got that in his head, that is what he wanted to write about, associated with this idea is another. So the most important thing in our lives is not ourselves, but our encounter with the other, in the form of the other person in front of us in a face-to-face encounter. And again, he roots this in all kinds of psychological stuff, which I don't really understand, but we've been, Yaya talked about the baby's first encounter with the face of the mother this afternoon, I think, and Levinas was very into that and said, this is the kind of crucial encounter of the baby with the mother, the first face-to-face encounter. And in our encounter with the other, in the form of the other person, this other implores us to recognize its suffering. And in responding, we discover our responsibility for others. So we see a suffering person in front of us, and this is the big driving force in our life, is to try and ameliorate that suffering. And so ethics is lived. It's not an abstract sort of discussion about, what's good and what's bad and what's right and what's wrong. It's a lived thing. It emerges from this encounter. It's first philosophy, as Levinas said. It's not an abstract code. Ethics is the good of the other. And of course, he came up with this stuff. I mean, he wrote he published a book on this in the 60s, but I mean, it's rooted in the context of the Holocaust. And he said that because the Nazis denied recognizing suffering in the face of the other, that's what led them to the Holocaust, because they didn't dare look into the face of the suffering other, otherwise they wouldn't have been able to do what they did. So it's very much a theory which came about in a specific historical context. And he said that the onset of the other is exterior to ourselves and transcends us. The expression on the face of the suffering other interrupts our ego-centered activity, calls us to account for ourselves, and impels us to act. This founds our subjective being in the world by giving it meaningful direction and orientation. And so this is kind of not burdensome. You know, we don't think, oh goodness me, you know, I'm responsible for this other, what a drag that is. It's saying that on the contrary, this is what makes our life meaningful, and this is kind of why we get up in the morning, really. And so he says, this is not burdensome, this is working towards renouncing our ego, and leads to gratitude as we start to become aware of from whence we have our being. And the great 19th century Japanese Shin Buddhist teacher, Kiyozawa Manshi, wrote, where is the infinite other power? In other words, how do we know about the other power? And he said, it's visible in all our receiving. You know, this is where we know that there is another power because we can see what it gives us. We learn of the existence of other power through what it gives us. It's only through the other that we're constituted as beings at all, really, you know. This fits in with the Buddhist thing about having no separate identity that is permanent, but we're always in constant relation with other people. So to come back from this rather lengthy digression to the main point, although Levinas was not a Buddhist and hailed from what looks like a completely different, or a culture with a completely different set of preoccupations, he puts his finger here on exactly what, to my mind, a Buddhist training should be all about: learning to recognize and react to the suffering and needs of the other. And you know, that part of the body's up for vow. Innumerable are sentient beings, we vow to save them all. Is kind of pure Levinas. A non-Buddhist is clarifying something Buddhist for us, as is so often the way. So just like Levinas, perhaps we are not too concerned with abstract philosophical analysis. We're just concerned with doing our spiritual practice, putting one careful foot in front of another. In our case, of course, our practice is in Nembutsu, a practice of calling out to the Buddha, then listening out for the Buddha, seeing the Buddha in the face of the other, and then finally responding through acting. As Dhammavidya has said many times, everything skillful that we do is a form of Nembutsu. Everything flows into this bodhisattva path of listening, seeing, and responding. So let's develop our sense of the spirit of this training a little bit more. I'd like at this point to read you a short poem by Gary Snyder, one of my favorite poets, devout Buddhist and groundbreaking environmentalist since the 1950s, who celebrated his 90th birthday earlier this year. This poem is, as I say, it's only short. It's probably broadly autobiographical. It tells of a simple incident in the life of a young American who was trained in Zen Buddhism in temples in Kyoto in Japan, and on returning to North America takes a series of casual jobs, including working as a forest lookout, watching out for fires. In this particular poem, he's shown working in a motel or roadhouse on a long, bleak forest road which leads from the United States through Canada's Yukon to Alaska. In the poem, he's asleep in the roadhouse, miles from anywhere, in the middle of the night, when a bell rings to tell him that a customer has arrived and wishes to buy petrol or gas, as many of you will call it. To his sleepy mind, this brings back memories of Kyoto. So if I can just read you this. So it's at White River Roadhouse in the Yukon by Gary Snyder. At White River Roadhouse in the Yukon, A bell rings in the late night. A lone car on the Alaska highway, hoping to buy gas at the shut roadhouse. For a traveler sleeping in a little room, the bell ring is a temple in Japan. In dream, I put on robes and sandals, chant sutras in the chilly Buddha hall. Now, 10,000 miles of white spruce targa. The roadhouse master wakes to the night bell, enters the dark of ice and stars to sell the car some gas. Now, when poems are read to me in situations like this, I can never kind of grasp them straight away because, but just to emphasize what this is about, really, I love this poem about an apparently small incident because it reminds me of the transferability of our Buddhist practice, how we can put it to work in our life, how it's a training for that life. So in the poem, in Kyoto, a bell had rung in the night to summon Snyder to the shrine room for his Zazen practice or similar in the middle of the night. And this training equips him for life beyond the temple so that when another bell rings in the roadhouse back in North America, he can respond as he's been trained to do and get up and serve the customer with the petrol he needs to continue his lonely journey in the dead of night through this deserted, ghostly landscape. So this serving of the customer becomes a form of Zazen in the wider arena of life beyond the shrine room. He's seen what is needed doing in the service of another and simply done it. He knows this guy needs petrol, he needs gas. He gets up, the bell rings, he gets up and he does it. Now, similarly for us, I think our chanting Nembutsu practice is a training, a rehearsal which enables us to recognize that the actions which we perform beyond the shrine room need to be forms of Nembutsu too. We must train ourselves to recognize the suffering other, to listen out for the bell, and then to venture out, to enter the dark of ice and stars, to sell the car some gas. To my mind, this is the underlying spirit of our training and really underpins everything in the training guide. So whatever part of our training we're involved with, at whatever point we are, whether it's studying Pure Land history or learning about sutras as part of Vow 22 or assisting in rites of passage or discussing something with our mentor, it's not about filling us up with knowledge. It's about enhancing our ability to listen out for the other, the Buddha, and to respond. So I think this is what is meant by another part of the Bodhisattva vow. You know, the Bodhisattva vow is always asking us to do these impossible things. So that line, immeasurable are the Dharma teachings, we vow to master them all. Wow. We're vowing to be alert to the other, to learn from it, to allow it to train us, to be open to infinite possibilities, unconstrained by the limitations of our finite egos. So, you know, what that means, I think that lovely line, immeasurable are the Dharma teachings, we vow to master them all. It's not saying that, you know, there are an infinite number of texts out there and we have to learn them all off by heart. It's not saying that. It's saying that it's infinite in the sense of that we never stop learning, and whether we're on an ordination path or not, as Buddhists, we never stop learning. We should never stop learning. When I used to teach secondary school, what many of you think of as high school, we used to go on to the kids all the time about, you know, education doesn't stop when you've just done your exams. It's a lifelong learning. And of course, you know, the bit in the training guide is only part of a huge, much wider learning experience. So finally, I just want to say about a bit about the global context of all this. And Dhammavidya said it much better than I could in his inaugural Dharma talk at the beginning of the retreat. Said a lot of, you know, really important things about globalism, which I've just taken. There are some of these and developed them a little bit in here. Because I was a history teacher, so I get a bit sad about all this sort of stuff. But Buddhism has always been a global religion. It's always aspired for global reach. This is not something, you know, obviously it's got a lot more technology at its disposal these days. But it started in India in the 4th century BCE. By the late 3rd century, it was in Sri Lanka, China, the 1st, 2nd century CE, Korea, Vietnam, Japan by about 600 in the Christian era, on to Tibet and Mongolia, Thailand, Myanmar, Nepal. Then in the 18th and 19th centuries, westwards, associated with empire and romantic interest in the exotic East, and then continued westward as a result of migration in the mid 20th century. Of course, the occurrences in Tibet had a huge influence on the spread of the Dharma to America in particular. And now perhaps we're kind of, some of us in the West are, Buddhism is kind of re-exported eastwards again on a worldwide basis, and to places where it possibly had never penetrated before, Israel, South America. So it is truly becoming global, but it's always had a global aspiration, that's what I'm saying. Now, of course, in 21st century globalization is a bit of a double-edged sword, and it's a tricky and a slippery concept. And if on the one hand we assume that information technology and other forms of communication are making the world a smaller place and bringing us all closer together, then that can be both a positive and a negative phenomenon. On the negative side, we all know that globalization can be a rapacious force. There's an ever new quest by so-called developed nations for raw materials, cheap labor, and markets to advance their prosperity. And of course, as we know all too well, all this is associated with debt, internal conflict, some of it finding expression in religious fundamentalism, poverty, perpetual assault on the environment, droughts, famines, and an increasing gap between rich and poor. And we've heard, very moving testimony of this recently. On the more positive side, globalization enables us to be far more aware of these problems and to try as Buddhists to be insightful about them, and in our own small way, perhaps to contribute towards solving them. And the writer on Buddhism, David Loy, talks about the opportunities globalization brings our religion, and kind of tries to conceptualize ways in which we can move negative things into positive things. How we can, despair is a valid starting point sometimes, but it can't be the end point. And Loy talks about transforming greed into generosity, ill will into loving kindness, and delusion into wisdom. He talks about the importance, and again, these are resounding themes that are emerging during the week to do with solidarity. We talked about that, I think, in different sessions. Contentment, compassion, community, and as far as it is warranted, hopefulness. I don't mean insanely, irrationally optimistic, but a little bit of hopefulness goes a long way, perhaps. And the basis of this, of course, is that none of us want affliction and grief, and we should understand that nobody else does either. And a lady called Anne Glegg, who I've got a lot of time for, who's written a lot about kind of modern and postmodern Buddhist movements, particularly in the States, in a great book called, I think it's called American Dharma. But she said that, any move towards globalization of Buddhism, we must be careful not to put our own culture at the center. And I think that's really, really important. And it's an opportunity to learn about the diversity of cultures that we come from, and not assume that there's going to be a Eurocentric model or an Asian-centric model, but just genuinely listen to the other. And that's an important part of our training, I think. And it's been amply illustrated this week, listening to people from India, listening to people from Italy, from wherever it might be, and realizing that there will be universal issues that we all face, but they will take particular cultural forms according to which little screen we're operating at. We're sitting in at the moment on our Zoom vision. So it's a great vision, you know, but how do we even begin to bring it about? Well, through Buddhist training of the kind I've spoken about above, I think, and through the document that Dhammavidya and the Acharyas produced. And we have a simple, central, universal practice with global reach, the Nembutsu. It's portable, as we know, we can carry it with us, can go anywhere and everywhere. It's nice to have a shrine room, but we don't need one. So it can link us together, bind us together, unite us through this very simple act of chanting and hearing, of seeing the suffering of others, of remembering the Buddha together. And because the Nembutsu can take an infinite number of forms, it will emerge in different ways and take different forms in different cultures and societies. So our Pure Land Buddhist training is about how to appreciate both the universality of Nembutsu and its specificity in different localities. It's about globalism and localism, or glocalization, somebody coined that phrase. The interaction of the global and the local. About similarity, we all practice Nembutsu, and difference, we practice it in different contexts. We're training to recognize the universality of the suffering of others in their specific cultural forms. This may take us beyond Pure Land as a category. Alice Walker touched on this universality when she said that one can live an authentic religious life beyond categories like Christian or Buddhist simply by confronting suffering and embracing struggle. Some of those struggles may be large, some small, but all important to those caught up in them. I had a very interesting chat with Priti yesterday in a breakaway group, and she was saying, you know, the important thing is not to worry too much about why we're suffering. That's important, but you know, just to try and see what can I do in this instant to move forward with it. And I think training has to get us to respond to that. So all these struggles result in their own, you know, minor way or major way. Right from, you know, trying to cheer up the person in the bus queue to the kind of work that Modgala and Dhammavidya have done, and very extreme war and disease situations, and Amida India is obviously involved in huge work like that. But everything on from the small scale interaction with people to the large stuff, that's what we're training for. And I can't claim to have done anything large, and I'm in awe of people who have. So all of these relate to resisting oppression, assisting the afflicted, and demonstrating an alternative. And there's nothing which is not a training opportunity if we become alert to the presence of the other in our lives. In fact, the alertness is the training. It brings us face to face with the other and can bridge huge distances. So training also involves sharing our sense of where Nembutsu is in our lives. And Vow 22 can give you an experience of that, because we share the answers that we give to questions and so on and so forth, and appreciating other ways in which people use their Buddhist practice in quite simple but unexpected ways. I read a thing about I don't know how relevant this is really, but I read a thing the other day about how in Thailand people have ordained trees to stop them being chopped down, you know, because the Thais have such respect for an ordained status in someone that, you know, if you ordain a tree, there's no way they're going to chop it down. And I thought this was incredibly moving, you know, and it's an example of just applied Buddhism, but in such a straightforward and simple but fascinating and moving way, really. And the more specific we are, the more we look at what individual people and groups of people are doing in different cultural situations, the more we look at that fights back against Eurocentrism or American centrism, or against unquestioned, bland Buddhist kind of universal mindfulness of one size fits all. It makes it much more individual and human, and resists homogenization. So in conclusion, and again, this is a very, very personal take on this, but I would say We just need to keep training and keep listening out for that bell ringing out on the Alaska highway or wherever in the world you happen to be, because it's calling us all to our own Nembutsu practice. Thank you very much for turning up this afternoon, and Namo Amida. Obviously, if people want to say anything, providing the questions aren't too hard, that's absolutely fine. Thank you.
Well, I've got a very hard question. I was very struck by what you said about Levinas and how his whole philosophy, his approach to life and so on, had been affected by this great suffering. And this is one of the great dilemmas in training people is well, you can't do that to people. You know, it may be the case that the greatest educator is great suffering, but that can't be your syllabus. You know, that you'll lock people up in a prison camp or something, or kill their parents, or
yeah,
and I mean, we've tried to tackle this in some ways by sometimes sending trainees to work in India, for instance, where the conditions are much tougher than Birmingham. But it's a dilemma, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I was getting at really was the kind of mechanism that he was talking about in relation to the other, really. And you know, obviously his cultural situation was incredibly extreme. And I wouldn't suggest that I mean, I think, you know, some of the situations that people I know, Buddhist chaplains I know, have encountered have been very, very sharp-end indeed. And you know about this, Dhammavidya, but I wasn't suggesting for a minute that we're all going to be exposed to that kind of situation. It's Levinas's mechanism that I was kind of getting at, really, and saying that, you know, people, even if somebody's suffering in quite a small way, you can still learn from that and you can still help them. And I think it's not, you know, suffering will appear in our lives in all kinds of forms, and some will appear very minor when looked at against other ones which are obviously very, very big. But I think the mechanism involved is the same, is just learning from, you know, as we know, suffering is ubiquitous. And, you know, there's a lot of people who, my old Theravada teacher used to say, there's a lot of people will deny totally that they're suffering. And then you said, well, you know, is your life perfect? Well, no, it's not, you know, I wish I had a bigger car or whatever. So I think whatever the level of suffering, it's that what I think he has to teach us is that it's a unit. He emphasizes the universality of it. You know, that you know, you can recognize it in the face of a refugee, but equally you can recognize it in its own way in the face of people who are just encountering day-to-day differences. And it's that attitude of mind towards others, whatever they're experiencing, whatever their level of suffering is, that is a significant thing, I think. I'm not implying that we all have to have kind of catastrophe training.
Well, actually, I also think, Dhammavidya and Richard, I think we don't have a lack of suffering, and certainly, you know, with the situation in the world and the ecological crisis that we have, we can't expect it to become less in the next years, but rather the opposite. So probably it's also about helping others as well as ourselves to not turn away from that, but actually find the faith to face it and to talk about it and to, you know, confront ourselves with that and work with that and support each other in that situation. So because I don't think we need to look out for the suffering. It's all there. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I mean, it
Mm.
arrives on our doorstep, whether we like it or not, doesn't it? In one form or another, really. And yeah, no, that's true.
But it's easy to run away or to turn away, distract oneself, or try to convince oneself that it's not so bad, or that it's somewhere else, it's not where I am, and all that. So the usual mechanisms that we employ to dodge the degree of suffering that is there, the pain of suffering.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and it needs courage to look at it, to stop and look at it, to feel it, and to work with that, to
Yeah.
practice with that.
Yes, I mean, I think that I never used this word really, and I there's people here that know a lot more about this than I am, but I suppose what I'm saying is really that it's a resilience training, and how to cope without. It's the old problem, isn't it? How to, if you over empathize, you perhaps can't do anything. And if you under empathize, you're not motivated to do anything really. But I think to come back to Levinas for a minute, I think he's saying that, you just said about, suffering will come to us. And he was saying that basically it's not a kind of add-on, it's implicit in this relationship with the other, that we have from being born really, is that this is a kind of imperative that drives it's kind of built into our DNA, if you like. It's an imperative which drives us, and it's not that we have at some stage a kind of I mean, I haven't read him deeply enough to think, but he gives the impression he's not saying that normally we have an unproblematic encounter with the other, that that everything's fine, and that then suffering comes along, and that's an abnormality which we then recognize. He's saying that the suffering is built into this is what makes him so Buddhist, I think, in my mind, is that the suffering is built into our condition. It's there right from that first contact with the other, is that we recognize that, here is a person that that will get upset, or, that life is not satisfactory for that person, and that we kind of relate ethically to that, really.
Another thing I really liked in your talk just now was this poem at the what is called the gas station or petrol station.
Yeah.
And it reminded me of what I tried to address in the session this afternoon. The theme of translation. In a way, he was kind of translating his Dharma training into an everyday life situation, and that is probably also what the service is about.
Yeah, I mean, transferability of skills is how I would put it, really.
Yeah.
It's not just a skill, really, but it's yeah, I mean, thank you. Yes, I'm glad you like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I do because it's a very it's a very basic situation. He's not doing anything special, but with what is inside him and his whole attitude, his whole being in the situation, makes it like it's practice. It's what the Dharma is about.
Yeah. Yes, I loved the small scale aspects of it, but at the same time, it's a kind of universal thing as well. It's a kind of grandeur to it, really. But I just love it. Yeah. Thank you.
I think the poem is very nice, and it illustrates the layeredness of our mind, of our encounter with life. That he's out in the Canadian wilderness, but he's also in Japan.
Yeah.
Both at the same time.
Yeah.
And you know, the fashion now is to talk about being in the here and now and not in the there and then. But the really important bit of this experience is the there and then.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in my understanding, that is the real mindfulness.
Yeah. Yeah.
That he has in his mind, in his heart, that experience from Japan, which is from the past and from far away, but which gives an extra meaning to going down the steps in the gas station to serve a customer.
Yeah.
And makes what would otherwise be a very mundane, ordinary, utilitarian act into something holy.
Yeah.
And that's the real power of mindfulness correctly understood. Is the Dharma that you have in your mind, the Nembutsu, in one form or another, makes the ordinary act holy.
Yes, I think the whole business about becoming sacred, you know, is yes. I think that's something I was kind of reaching towards without being conscious of it, really. But yes, it does become a kind of sacred act for him, an unassumingly sacred act. You know, it's a very humble sort of thing. But yeah, I could talk about this poem all night, really, but I resist the temptation.
Well, we obviously picked up the energy of it from you.
Good.
I was wondering if the Vow 22 training guide or course is meant for people that are on a track to be ordained and going into a ministry, or can you see it as just a way to focus and deepen your practice on a more personal kind of level?
Yes, I mean, I don't want to speak for Dhammavidya on this, but how you say on this, but I think that it's the training guide itself is intended for people who with a serious intention, with a serious desire for ordination, but on Vow 22 obviously can be taken as part of the training. But on Vow 22, historically, ever since it's been going, Dhammavidya and Sistama started it years ago, and it's kind of been going in different forms for a long time. And we've had people with all kinds of backgrounds and interests and taking it, not just people wanting to ordain. So Vow 22 can be a component of a training regime, but it's not the regime itself. And we have people with all, I think at one stage we had an Anglican vicar doing it. We've had people can just pick out different modules. We had a guy from the States a few months ago who had been to some of Dhammavidya's Saturday morning sessions, I think, who just wanted to do the module on Buddhist psychology, so he just did that. And we get quite a few people who come along and say they're interested in a particular aspect of Pure Land Buddhism. We just buy a one-off module and that's that. So it's very, very flexible in that sense, and it's just for people who want to deepen their own particular interests or enthusiasms, really.
It's one of the practical aspects of the training regime, which is still evolving. We've not reached a final form, I think, really. Is that the individual trainee has a tabella. They have a sheet on which they list all the things that they do that might be considered to contribute to their training. And this may be, I read such and such a book, or it might be, I went to Delhi as a volunteer to work in the project there, or I led a service on Sunday afternoon, or it could be a whole variety of different things, but they keep a log of these things. And then periodically, every few months, they have an interview with one or other of us, myself sometimes, Richard probably they'll see next time, and they review where they've got to. Now, this provides a sort of framework for training, means you can keep track in some way of the training that people are doing. And this is, as Richard just said, and it's primarily designed for people who are heading for ordination, but we're experimenting with making it available to mitras in the order. And we might make it available to other people in due course. I'm not sure. It depends how it goes and what our experience of it is. But the Vow 22 program, which is part of the training, yes, is available to anybody who wants to buy into it, basically, I think. Talk to Richard.
Yes, thank you, David. I forgot to say about the keeping a log, but yeah, that is quite important. That I think, again, I can't speak for him, but I think we want people to take responsibility for their own learning as far as possible, and then talk about that with a mentor. But you know, that the individual person keeps a record of how they proceed through the regime.
The initiative is very much with the individual, I think.
You know, I also liked what you said about being vigilant with the dominance of a Eurocentristic approach, and having that kind of glasses on, you know, this, I think, particularly considering a global Sangha, and that we come from various cultural differences and probably also social differences. So it's important not to focus, I think, so much on, you know, like writing an essay at the end of study X, Y, Z, you know, but having the freedom of finding creative ways of communicating one's understanding, like with the one piece of art that you just showed us, and I think it's also in the goodie bag. Yeah, so it's I find that, you know, more important than we probably think, that there are different ways how one can express one's understanding, and that it doesn't have to be in a written form, or you know, in the usual in the form that we think is normal, but can be different. So that is, I think, an important aspect of what you said.
Yes, thank you very much for that. I think that is so true. I think, you know, respecting individuals' aptitudes and motivations, and trying to, you know, broaden out the whole idea of what we mean by training for an ordained role, you know.
Yes, and of course this is true both ways round. The training for ordination might be extended to people who are not heading for ordination. It's also true, of course, that some people might get ordained without having done this training, if they've got the right spirit, and you know, they demonstrate that in a sense they don't even need the training. It's not, we're not a kind of what can you say, tick the boxes and then you get to the end sort of thing. Each case is different. I think the basic question that you posed, really, Richard, how do you train a global Sangha? We should go on thinking about forever.
Yeah.
go on learning and experimenting and finding out new things, because you're always training. I'm still training. We're all training.
Well, I guess you just said it, it's very much about the spirit. It has a lot of respect for diversity. Something you also say very often, respecting that we are all different, and still have that sense of community. And that is, there's something quite magic about that, allowing that kind of diversity and having something that is in it all, that brings us together and gives us strength as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so if it would probably even be not so helpful to write it all down in every detail, because it's too tight in some way, and it can't be organic anymore, and can't appreciate all that unfolding diversity. It's not like a set diversity, it's an unfolding organic diversity. And so it needs, I think, the space to develop.
Yeah.
Well, one of the problems of any kind of what you might call person-centered education is that is whether people will give it sufficient priority. Because the way people are, if you say you must have this essay in by Friday, and then next week you must do so and so, and you must have that finished by Thursday, many people will respond to that and put that at the top of their list. Whereas if you say choose what you like and do it when you like, many people will put that at the bottom of their list. So it's tricky,
Yeah, we encountered that with Vow 22 quite a bit, really, in the sense that when I first came on board, I worked with Sistama on it a lot, and we were trying to get the kind of ethos right and be welcoming, and as of course is very important. And we kind of fell over ourselves because we know that a lot of people who take these courses have young families, family commitments, their work, they're trying to fit it in when they can. And so we kind of fell over ourselves to be, understanding and not try and be very flexible and not try and impose deadlines. But as Dhammavidya says, the flip side of that is that people think, well, and we do have quite a few people who perhaps we needed to be a bit more chasing up and encouraging on, and without being saying where's your essay, but we needed to just perhaps check in with people more and say, is there a problem with time on this, and and get it right. But again, it's that in itself is a learning experience, and it's getting the balance right. You don't want to be an enforcer